How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew, this is Lemora's Cards, and today we're doing something a little bit different. Today I'm going to be discussing some of cEDH's best cards. Recently with the printing of Orcish Bowmaster, and a little bit earlier with cards like Soul Ring were being discussed. People have been really talking about bans in EDH, cEDH, and if you've been a fan of the channel, you've watched for a while, you know that I love talking about format philosophy and design and incentivizing players to do the fun thing. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the most impactful and powerful cards in cEDH and discussing if they are bannable, why not, both in the context of Commander at large and in cEDH. So we got 5 tiers here. Tier 1 is bannable. These are the cards that I think very strongly have a case for being banned, both for their impact on casual play and in cEDH. Bannable for cEDH, these are the cards that are mostly fun and casual for one reason or another, but actually make such a big splash in cEDH, something with the meta, that they just are too powerful here and should be at least considered if we were looking to ban just for the max power level. Tier number 3 are cards that have some problems. These are cards that create some sort of issues in player incentives or with negative play patterns, but aren't enough to warrant a banning at this point. Tier number 4 is strong but fair. These are your cards that are power outliers, but to the fairest extent, they have either some sort of downside or a cost that seems appropriate, even though they are still some of the stronger cards and they are staples in their colors. And not approaching bannable, these are the cards that are totally fine. They either trade very fairly, have very common answers. These are the cards that are not problematic really in any way. Okay, and with that being said, let's just hop into it. This video is brought to you by Inked Gaming. Inked has amazing artwork to choose from for playmats, mouse pads, bags, and other accessories, while also allowing you to upload your own custom artwork to show off your style. Check out the affiliate link in the description below to level up your look and support the channel. This video is brought to you by Card Trader. Card Trader Zero is a service that lets you buy cards from all over the world with no extra shipping fees. Cards are sent to Card Trader to verify, and they'll keep them until you're ready to get them all at once with a single shipping fee. Register at the link in the description below to get $2 just for signing up. We're going to be going alphabetical order, and that means we are starting with Ad Nauseam. As strong as it is and impactful as it is, I believe it's actually firmly in the not approaching bannable. From a casual perspective, this is one of the most fair cards you can run in casual Commander, where mana values tend to be a lot higher. In cEDH, this is a archetype defining card, although that archetype isn't necessarily one of the strongest ones, although the mid-range Ad Nauseam lists have been doing well. It's got plenty of answers. It incentivizes deck building that is highly efficient, but recently, with the printing of so many powerful, like 2, 3, 4 drop creatures, especially just permanents, deciding to run Ad Nauseam is more of a cost. I think that puts it in the very fair category, even though it is obviously a very powerful spell if you get to resolve it. Any 5-drop in this format is probably going to be that. Deflecting Swat. Now, I love red, and I like that red decks get access to it, but I think Deflecting Swat is bannable for cEDH, mainly because of what it incentivizes. It incentivizes very cheap commanders. It incentivizes rushing out your commander, which is already a part of it. It rewards something you already want to do, and that's always going to be tricky, especially when the reward is free interaction, which is incredibly powerful. Giving a tool like this to a deck like Najeela or the Rogue Rack decks is already just rewarding them for doing something inherently powerful, and the deck that would really like this with the 4, 5, 6 mana commanders, it's a lot weaker in those lists, and those are the ones, in my opinion, that typically need the help more. Now, Demonic Consultation, I'm going to go ahead and lump this in with Thassa's Oracle and Tainted Pact. We're going to do these all at once because it's kind of hard to separate them. I think Thassa's Oracle is totally fine as a win con for the most part. I don't have a strong opinion on it, but it is a power outlier, being the most efficient win con in the best color in the format, in my opinion. And it is very much creeping up on casual. It is, last I checked, the most played blue creature in Commander on EDH Rec. If you're hoping for fair combat-focused gameplay that lasts 6 to 10 turns, Thassa's Oracle is not a card you want in that slot. Because of that, and because I think most of the decks already running Thassa's Oracle get access to pretty similar power level win cons without being as cheesable, not as fast. You know, I think the banning of Thassa's Oracle doesn't hurt the format. It does slow it down by maybe a turn. The odds of being able to do a turn 1 or turn 2 win go down, but I don't think the format becomes very slow, and I think the decks that were on Thoracle already have so much going for them that I don't think it would necessarily be that unhealthy. So even though I'm not passionate about it, I actually think Thassa's Oracle is a pretty bannable card. With that being said, I think in that world, Demonic Consultation has some problems, being the most efficient way to get rid of your library, which is still pretty strong. And Tainted Pact, I would put in the strong but fair category. It's a high-risk tutor in a world where Thassa's Oracle isn't gone. And I think there's also a world where you just ban Demonic Consultation and let Tainted Pact Thassa's Oracle be the new most efficient win con at 4 mana, which puts it in line with combos like Witherbloom Apprentice Chain of Smog, even though that combo is still a little bit worse. So I think there's a couple ways you could do it. You could ban Consult and just have Tainted Pact and Thoracle be the new best win con. That again reduces the option of cheesing opponents out with just having 3 mana and being able to win turn 1, turn 2. But I think for the most part, especially looking at the long-term health of the format, especially at Casual Commander, removing a card like Thassa's Oracle, just 2 mana that says win the game, it's a little rough, and it is also a card that very much limits design space, I think, going forward. And the same can be said for the Forbidden Tutors, Demonic Consultation, and Tainted Pact. Dockside Extortionist. This is one that I would controversially say, from a power level perspective, for casual is probably fine. I haven't done the math. I know it's still very strong over there, but it's a big thing that you get to do mostly in the late game. Like if you're turn 2ing your Dockside in casual, it's not likely to go off like it is in cEDH. But if you play it like turn 8, you might make like 20 treasures. And that's just like a big cool thing. I think one thing that separates Dockside and Thassa's Oracle, even though they get brought up together a lot in terms of being bannable, is that Dockside allows you to play more Magic in a game, whereas Thassa's Oracle limits the amount of Magic you get to play. Thassa's Oracle says this game is now over. Dockside says this game is about to get crazy. And I think those are 2 very different things, even though you could lump them in together as being game-winning spells. I think Dockside enables so many decks. It enables a lot of interesting archetypes. It is part of the reason that red is actually relevant right now. I think Dockside represents some problems, despite being one of the most powerful cards in the format. I think banning it makes cEDH a lot less interesting. You could, probably if I was a designer, I would test saying like, hey, Dockside is banned for right now. Let's see how it shakes up. And especially like if they cared about cEDH, let an event run without Dockside and see what happens. But I really think the format actually shrinks a bit. And Dockside, I think, is a healthy card to punish things because it punishes your opponents by rewarding you. It lets you do more. It doesn't prevent them from getting to do their thing. And that's always like a more fun, generally healthy way because it doesn't disrupt them with a certain play pattern that it now enforces, right? It's not like a Deafening Silence Collector Oof type effect where it says, hey, you can't do the cool thing anymore. It says, well, you did so much cool stuff. Now I get to do a cool thing. Obviously, the card could have been balanced better, but here we are. We've got it. I'd like to see it stick around, but I could see maybe moving it up to bannable for cEDH and then kind of seeing how the format looks after that. Drannith Magistrate, I would put straight into bannable. I think this card, for a very efficient cost and to be asymmetrical, possibly even a color break. It's weird because white doesn't usually get asymmetrical hate pieces at this cheap of a mana value, but it discouraging not only what the format is based around, but also really popular and fun archetypes involving the graveyard and impulse draw, mostly speaking from a casual perspective. It's a little too splashable, I think, is its biggest problem in cEDH. If it was white, it'd be a very different story. Or if it was 3 mana, then it's more of a cost. But as it is now, just getting creatures on the board, especially in like a Tymna, Najeela kind of world, it's just so good and so free. And it, again, it doesn't discourage relying on your commander. It really discourages expensive commanders. The decks that you would want to not have rely on their commanders, the Najeelas, the Tymna decks, especially the Rograk decks, they mostly get out ahead of Drannith as long as the Drannith isn't like turn 1. Those are decks that are really focused on getting their commander out early. Drannith mostly punishes the decks that are in need, I would say, of help, or are just kind of like things you want to encourage. It's good to encourage commanders that aren't already inherently broken and enabling something very powerful. Esper Sentinel is absolutely bannable for cEDH. In casual, Esper Sentinel is still like fine, but you know, people are playing creatures, people have a little bit of mana up. You don't have to be as efficient in casual, so losing out on 1 mana to deny a draw, it's fine. Esper Sentinel also gets wiped way more often in a casual pod. But in cEDH, honestly, Esper Sentinel is borderline better than Mystic Remora because it doesn't have that cumulative upkeep that keeps you from developing. The biggest issue with an early Mystic Remora, especially if you keep it in a shaky hand, is that it really doesn't let you go as crazy while you're developing. You kind of have to, unless you have an absolutely ridiculous hand to start, you kind of have to choose to get cards for a few turns over developing. And the sort of give and take of it is that it prevents your opponents from developing typically without having to feed you cards. Esper Sentinel being able to just drop it, and honest, it's one of the best mulligan fixers ever. If you have a hand that can produce white mana and has an Esper Sentinel, it's probably a keep. And just having a one white Ancestral Recall so often, even every turn sometimes, Esper Sentinel just really does a bit too much in the format. And that something about it just makes it more innocuous, where people are just like, who cares? It's just one card. It's just paying the one. Something about feeding Esper Sentinel just seems like it happens more than Mystic Remora. Maybe that's just my experience. Let me know if that's how you experience it too. Now you see Scalding Tarn on your screen. We're not just talking about Scalding Tarn. We're talking about the fetch lands, which I maybe controversially think are bannable for cEDH. I think they reduce creativity in creating a mana base, because having perfect mana is just so good and so possible in this format. Reducing the things that make high color decks easy ultimately promotes greater variety in the format and makes things just a little better and more interesting. The complaint you'll often hear about fetch lands is that they just eat up so much time, which is absolutely true and absolutely annoying. So many games of cEDH start with all 4 players cracking a fetch. That sucks. That eats up time. That isn't necessarily something I would say makes them bannable, but it is an added benefit of getting rid of them. The main thing they do is make high color decks better. They make all of your 4 and 5 color piles just so much more consistent and smooth. And those, I don't think, are the decks we want to incentivize. I think good stuff piles have a place in the format, and it's not something I necessarily don't want to be able to exist, but they should have a cost, and that cost should be in consistency with the mana base. That's kind of the benefit of the land system, is that there's supposed to be some give and take, some lack of consistency to balance out monocolor versus high color deck. I think having to make more decisions with your mana base instead of just, okay, here's 25 staples for my 3 color pile, and then I can kind of choose the last 3 to 5 lands or something like that. It makes utility lands kind of irrelevant. Nothing that the fetch lands encourage is really good. They are more punishable now with the printing of Opposition Agent. The bonuses that they give in like landfall strategies in Casual Commander, I think are a plus. That's a big strategy over there, even though some people don't like it. But they don't really enable much of that here, barring decks like Tatyova and the new Nissa. So I think overall, they're just a net negative for cEDH. Fierce Guardianship, unlike Deflecting Swat, I think is a hard bannable all over. Deflecting Swat creates interesting moments with being able to change targets, especially in casual games where it doesn't necessarily prevent something from happening. Deflecting Swat can lead to cool, exciting things. Fierce Guardianship, that's very rarely the case. It does all of the negatives of Deflecting Swat, plus it just says, no, you don't get to cast a thing. And it hits so, like, hitting all non-creature spells is just kind of ridiculous too. Printing a better, mostly Force of Negation for Commander was kind of questionable. And yeah, I think Fierce Guardianship, coming from a wrong side player, it makes having a cheap Commander so good. Plus, it doesn't have any of the upside of being able to have, you know, sort of interesting niche interactions or political moments that happen. It just is, nope, it's a counterspell. You don't get to do it, and I get it for free. And it just promotes a lot of those same sort of negative things that I don't think the format should be looking to promote. Force of Will is one that doesn't usually get brought up in bannings. I specifically brought it up because I've got a lot of comments actually that people talk about how they don't like cards like Force of Will. Again, I think Fierce Guardianship is actually mostly better in the format. But Force of Will does get to hit everything. It doesn't require your commander. You can do it as, you know, on turn 0 if you've got a blue card. I think if you are wanting to really clean up the ban list and make powerful things not as much of a thing, you could say that it's strong but fair or has some problems. I think it's among some of the more balanced free interaction. Anything that has you go down a card is fairly relevant, especially once we get to the big card draw engines, if those were actually taken care of like they should be. But I think for the most part, Force of Will is not approaching bannable. It's very powerful. It can lead to frustrating moments, but I think especially if we're going to have a high power format that has crazy early ability to win with cheap A plus B combos, you kind of have to have a card like Force of Will around. And the card disadvantage of the spell really makes it less of an issue in casual, though it can lead to moments of, oh, I thought you said your deck was a 7, why is it running Force of Will? Which I don't think is necessarily an issue with the ban list. I think that's more of a player discussion type thing. Grand Abolisher. Some people might hate this card. I think it's strong but fair. Reducing the ability for players to interact obviously can create some issues where the rich get richer. I have a bunch of more cards. I'm more likely to be able to have a Grand Abolisher. But it also very much is one of the few effects, along with Silence, which I'll go ahead and move into strong but fair as well, that actually can dig out from the hole that you get put in by a card draw engine. Being able to say, hey, I don't care how many cards you drew, I'm going to get to push through this thing is really healthy in a format that has so many punishing value engines. Creating a must counter sort of thing, creating this big fight over a spell. These are going to be very highly impactful cards, but for the most part, they are fairly fair in this sort of environment where so much is going on, so many people can just get way ahead of you, and you just needing to get this one card through to get a chance to develop freely or go for your win con, which again, now with the printing of Beseju and Otawara, these cards are a little bit less effective, but still nonetheless incredibly powerful. You could possibly put Silence into the some problems category because it can sort of represent a 1 mana time walk, less so in casual where creature combat is way more relevant. But both of these effects I think are very much needed for a format that has this much card draw and this much interaction. Jewel Lotus I would throw straight into bannable. As a lot of casual people will tell you, this card doesn't really make games more interesting. It sort of just throws one player ahead. It either leads to feel bads for them when they get so far ahead the rest of the table bans against them, or it just has them just steamroll the rest of the table because their deck is built around this thing that they got out 3 turns earlier than they were supposed to. In cEDH, again, it promotes very specific sort of commanders. This is a card that I like Niv Mizzet having access to, decks like that inherently sort of need something to actually push them into viability. But honestly, most of the time what Jewel Lotus does is it just helps people get out their Crom faster. It helps people get out their Najeela turn 1 very easily with mana to back it up. It, again, just sort of promotes a lot of good stuff. This is a card that is mostly playable in every deck, but it's, again, better in the decks that have 3 or 4 mana commanders with not a lot of color pips. I think one really neat way to balance Jewel Lotus would have been giving it the Gigantha effect of this mana can't be used to pay generic mana cost, meaning that you have to have a very pip intensive commander to make much out of Jewel Lotus. So your decks like Niv Mizzet still get to keep it, but obviously it's only just the Lotus Petal and Najeela. Something like that would have been a lot more fair. As it is, I don't think the card does much other than promote more of that get your commander down as soon as you can, run a cheap commander, run all these spells to take advantage of having a cheap commander. It's very repetitive. It can be fun and good that it helps like a deck like Atraxa be able to get its commander out. But again, when you're looking at the greater scope of the format, the decks that it actually ends up helping the most are the decks that don't really need the help. Lotus Petal is, again, I think very much the not approaching bannable category. It is powerful, but again, it's kind of just a treasure for a card. And for the most part, it's just sort of a good card that lets you get a little bit extra value on a turn at the cost of going down a card. I think it's pretty fair. Obviously, it's just a slam dunk in basically every deck, but it doesn't really represent a play pattern. It doesn't create repetitive moments because the mana of Lotus Petal, it's such a flexible card, it can't be used on anything. It can be used on your first turn to help you get a bit of a start. It can be used on your post-Naws to be able to get going after you tap out. It's just a good flexible card that gives you a mana at the cost of going down a card. Pretty fair trade. You could put it in the strong but fair. It's not even a card that people, for the most part, have on their radar in casual. Anything that just has you go down a card is just inherently less good there. And I think at high power, it's just a thing that maybe creates some variance and rewards just having a good hand, but that's kind of the format we're in these high power level nonsense decks. So I'm going to do Mana Crypt and Sol Ring together because they kind of have a lot of similar things. Again, like I mentioned at the start, there was a whole debate on whether Sol Ring should be banned. I think for the most part, my answer is yes. I think Sol Ring and Mana Crypt are both very bannable cards if you want a format resembling anything close to what most people would describe as fair Magic. These cards just get you so far ahead. They're sort of like Lotus Petal, like I mentioned, where they're just create even higher variants, but these don't just pay you out for one turn, right? Lotus Petal helps you get one good turn for a card. These make the rest of your game significantly better. There are arguments that, cards like these, in casual games, they just have people, if you turn one Sol Ring, that they'll just group up on you. And that's Which may be a reasonable argument, but also if you're making a card that's so strong that the whole table has to group up on you when you play it on turn 1, maybe you don't put that in the format. Similar to Jeweled Lotus, it creates a feel bad one way or another. Either the players get beat up because they play these cards early, or the rest of the table just falls behind because this player develops so much mana advantage. The only other Magic format where you can have turn 1 Mana Crypt Soul Ring is Vintage, and the play patterns of Vintage aren't usually what you want, period, but also I think especially not what the rules committee has in mind for what casual commander should look like. And if you're going to put these cards out there, you're going to let them be legal, players are going to play them and do crazy things. And again, with cards like the Talismans, it's very easy to go turn 1, land, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Esper Sentinel, Mystic Remora. Like, these cards highlight how overpowering a good hand can be, and I don't think that level of variance really improves the format that much. Again, these do encourage, to an extent, high cost commanders. They make it more reasonable to cast something like an Atraxa or even like a Tivit, but they also, again, make it very easy to go land, Mana Crypt, Najeela, land, Mana Crypt, Rhystic Study. I don't think they lead to very fun experiences for the entire table. They're clearly extreme power outliers. It's why they're banned everywhere except for Vintage. I don't think they add a lot to the format, especially if the worries of the rules committee or casual players at large are that the format is getting too fast. The format is getting too fast. I don't think it's because new cards are pushing it that way. Not necessarily, at least. There's a reason you don't see a ton of new cards on this list, because a lot of the power of this format is in the old cards that have just been allowed to stay because players self-regulate. But as you get new players, hey, I want to win the game. Mana Crypt seems like a good way to do that. Throw it in the deck. I have whole videos about this. You can check this out here. I don't think Mana Crypt and Soul Ring encourage what casual play wants. They do allow cEDH to be a little bit crazier and wilder. So you could argue if you want cEDH to be as wild as possible, then they're cool cards for the format. I think trying to look at it objectively, they're just too strong. You wouldn't want a card that has this much power in it for so cheap to be a mainstay of most formats. So I think depending on what you want, you could say this isn't bannable for cEDH, but I think is absolutely bannable for casual commander. Sort of the opposite, Mystic Remora, very bannable just for cEDH. Along with Esper Sentinel, creates huge resource imbalances. I think in general, I've made videos about this too, having cards that punish casting spells, not very interesting for your game that's about casting spells, especially at such a cheap mana value. Mystic Remora, again, has some cost to it, but that cost mostly applies to turn 1 mystics that were kept on shaky hands. If you go turn 1, land, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Mystic Remora, you're fine. You have so much mana to pay. You're going to be drawing cards because people are going to have to start playing into it at some point. It just creates, again, massive resource imbalances very early in the game, requires fairly niche answers. A lot of the answers in cEDH are bounce. Bounce spells suck against Mystic Remora unless you're trying to go off that turn. Obviously, cards like Mental Misstep hit this, but cards that demand early answers like that because they create such massive resource imbalances and the play patterns of them that are when they're very negative, like Esper Sentinel and Mystic Remora, of just like, do you pay the 4? Do you pay the 1? Oh, you decided to cast spells. Oh, how unfortunate. You shouldn't be playing this game that we signed up to play. I don't think helps. And also, blue having access to the two best of these effects, arguably, again, helps the rich get richer. The downside of blue in the format is that counter spells tend to be negative on card advantage. And when you have things that benefit counterspell wars or just general stack interaction or playing the game, like Mystic, and we'll get to Rhystic Study, it shores up that weakness very quickly and very efficiently. Najeela is a card I think has some problems. Najeela is not terrorizing every tournament. It's not outperforming everything. So I think saying it's bannable for cEDH is a bit of a stretch, even though it is one of the most consistently performing decks kind of throughout cEDH's history. It encourages 5-color good stuff quite a bit. It has literally been effective as a stacks deck, as a mid-range deck, and as a turbo deck, which is a little scary. The same could be said for Kinrith, but I think Najeela, representing such easy combos, was buffed incredibly hard by the printing of Jeweled Lotus, Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat, Deadly Rollick. It's a deck that I think, especially if players were really playing the thing they thought was the strongest, if everyone who thought Najeela was the best were playing it, the performance of this deck would probably be enough to maybe think about it. I know designers have talked about the card itself being a mistake. It's very easy to combo off with. I think it's fine in cEDH as it is. The deck obviously encourages a lot of the things I've been saying today you don't necessarily want to encourage. But as it is, I think especially if you ban that that top row of cards that are problematic or the one below it, Najeela gets weakened quite a bit, losing a lot of that stuff that makes her so crazy, and then becomes a bit more fair. And she does have some weaknesses, and that can be a deck that's kind of hard to mulligan with. It doesn't have inherent card advantage. Fetching even can be a bit tricky in a 5-color deck at the moment. Addressing some of those more powerful cards that have enabled Najeela to be even better than before, you end up with a card that, again, is maybe an issue in casual if people really were playing it more, with how easy it is to just go off. But for the most part, it's a fine card. It represents some issues, but I think especially if you address some other cards, Najeela would be okay. Opposition Agent, I would put pretty highly at strong but fair. Maybe you could argue some problems, but I think for the most part, Opposition Agent in casual games kind of stops the more powerful things people do. It's not a card I think people are jamming a lot in casual. It does hit fetch lands, which can suck, and land ramp, but honestly, being able to interact with land ramp is probably totally fine in that format where that's very powerful. The biggest issue Opposition Agent really represents in cEDH is just it being there along with a lot of these other cards. When you have an Opposition Agent, a Rhystic Study, a Drannith out, it can really clog up the board state. And again, it's very splashable at 2 and a black. It's easy to go land, crypt, pass. Oh, got you with the op agent. But I think for the most part, it doesn't represent negative things. It can create interesting moments of politicking and trying to sort of threat assess, giving your opponent access to something so that they can answer something for you. It's a card, again, that I think if a couple of these cards were addressed, we would see less of. And again, maybe when we get to see how this next card that we're going to be talking about plays out, maybe Opposition Agent just isn't as great as it used to be. And that next card is Orcish Bowmasters. I think has some problems. I don't think this is a slam dunk must ban, OMG, get it out of here type card. The way Bowmasters is playing out right now, I don't think it's a must ban. We'll see coming forward, especially once we get to like the cookout. It's the next big in-person event. Right now, it seems strong. It punishes a lot of the most powerful cards in the format. Sort of. It's triggered by these card draw value engines, but it doesn't necessarily punish them, right? Because it really, to get value out of it, it needs to hit creatures. Hitting players, unless you have like 20, 30 damage to throw around, isn't really as big of a deal. I think what most of what Bowmasters is going to do is punish creatures, which are strong. As you can see, there are cards on here like Grand Abolisher, Opposition Agent, Drannith Magistrate. This doesn't really punish Dockside. It does punish Najeela. So it will punish those early commander focused decks. It will punish very creature heavy decks. Unfortunately, it's going to punish green, I feel like, pretty hard, which green really could use that not to happen to them. But we'll see how it plays out. I do think anything that pushes creatures down is roughly a negative for the format, especially in casual. Having just a 2-drop that can kill a commander because someone played a Return of the Wild Speaker or any of those big green draw effects. It can punish really big plays by just making the game harder to play. It kind of, like I mentioned with Thassa's Oracle, Drannith, unlike Dockside, this card makes your opponents be able to play less magic rather than allowing you to play more magic. Although it does give you a big attacker, so that can be fun. So we'll see how it shakes out, but I do think it's kind of in that borderline, got a couple issues with it category. I could see it possibly being bannable. We'll see if that ends up happening. And then we have Tymna here representing partners. This is something, depending on how you look at banning it, I think has some problems, right? So if you just banned Tymna, honestly, the format probably gets more interesting. Which sucks because Tymna's probably the most interesting partner that they've made, or one of the more interesting partners. But she's just so powerful. Maybe in a Bowmaster world, again, she gets a little bit weaker. But all the Tymna decks are going to be running Bowmasters so that they get more attackers and that people have less blockers. So we'll see how that shakes out. 2-color partners being partnered together, if that's popular, I think that's a little bit of a negative because it's just 4-color good stuff time and time again. I think it's a lot more interesting when you get into those 3-color pairings because I think decks tend to have more identity in 3 or less colors, which is kind of subjective. But to me, Grixis has way more of an identity than Blue Farm colors or Omnath colors. You know, Dawnwaker colors, something like that. You know, Bant has more of an identity. Temur has more of an identity where they're more defined by their card choices and they have to make some concessions to deck building. I think a 3-color or less heavy environment tends to be a little bit more interesting than 4 and 5-color good stuff and then a couple 3-color decks. So I'm really a fan of like Tymna Jessica getting to exist and Tymna Malcolm or Malcolm Vile Smasher. Decks that still have a strong identity and they use 2-color partners. Rograk Silas is another one that, while very powerful, has a very defined identity. It's a partner deck that is built around a commander still. So the 4-color partner decks, not as big of a fan of. I could see partners getting the axe maybe, but really what I would have preferred is 2-color partners that only go with 1-color partners. And I think also we've just seen the rise of decks like Tivit and Rocco that are able to just do enough without partners that they have an identity. They outperform a lot of partner decks. It's kind of required some power creep, but we're seeing partners no longer be the must-run sort of decks. Rhystic Study is going right into bannable. Unlike Mystic Remora and Esper Sentinel, this just punishes casting spells, period. You don't get to cast spells without paying me attacks or giving me a card. A stacks effect like this is as disruptive as a card like Rule of Law, except it was asymmetrical. You're not gonna see white get access to your opponents can only cast 1 spell per turn, especially at 3 mana. Rhystic Study is like as close as a card has got to that. Punishing casting spells forever, no cumulative upkeep, all of the spells, and it's asymmetrical is just way too much on a card, especially on a blue card. It's just too good. The play patterns of it are incredibly negative. It's just an absolutely outrageous card in a multiplayer format. I get that it's kind of a staple and it's representative of the format. That doesn't mean it's necessarily good and healthy. Looking at you, Soul Ring. I don't think Rhystic Study adds a lot to the format other than a lot of feel bads, a lot of high variance openings. It's too much and it doesn't give back enough. A lot of the players who will defend it are players who have got to play with Rhystic Study a lot and they love getting to play it. Cool for you, doesn't make it healthy. I do think playing around Rhystic Study creates some interesting moments sometimes, but it's not worth all the baggage that the card comes with. Last but not least, one of the coolest cards in all of Magic, Underworld Breach. This is my favorite card, I think, in cEDH. This is the card that has won me the most games by far. It's very bannable though. In my opinion, Underworld Breach is the best win condition in the format, and it doesn't even have to be with its combo with Brain Freeze LED. Underworld Breach plus the Tutor is one of the most effective win cons in the format. It is just so good at building a win out of what's left of your game. You play the game, Underworld Breach says, oh, you got to play the game earlier? Guess what? Let's go off, buddy. It's too good. It's so capable of stealing games. Again, I love that it's one of the cards Red's got that's very powerful. I like low color red decks getting access to it, but it's so splashable. It's a card that the more colors you get access to, the better it is. In mono red, it's fine. In blue red, it's pretty good. In Jeskai, it's really good. In blue farm colors, it's amazing because you get Demonic Tutor to grab it or Vamp Tutor. I think it's a card that ultimately encourages good stuff piles that generate a bunch of advantage, and then Boston Roll put it in one of his videos where if I'm not ready to win, I grab Rhystic Study. If I'm ready to win, I grab Underworld Breach. And that's sort of what a lot of decks do. The term like Grixis Enchantress to describe Roxai is kind of about that as well. It is an extreme power outlier. Again, we don't see it as much in casual where the card pool and how games tend to play out just doesn't line up as much with cEDH. But when you're playing a bunch of cheap tutors and cards like Lotus Petal and counter spells, throwing in a couple subpar cards into your deck and then jamming Underworld Breach, it's just so unbelievably powerful and it just can win games out of nowhere. Trust me, I've done it a bunch. It's amazing. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Maybe not all my points you agreed with, but let me know down in the comments below. What cards do you think are bannable? What is your criteria for being bannable? If the card creates really negative play patterns, if it makes less Magic be played versus more Magic, I think that's something I'm looking at a little bit more questionable. What it's punishing and what it's rewarding are the big things. Player incentives. Rhystic Study incentivizes nothing. It just tells your opponents to stop casting spells. A lot of the top cards here on Bannable, they don't really incentivize very interesting play patterns, I don't think. So again, let me know if you enjoyed this. Let me know if there's other cards you'd like for me to talk about. Big shout outs again to all my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you especially to big $10 patron LF Cruz. All the support I get over there very much directly helps me make better videos for you guys. Check out my merch. I think it's the best cEDH merch out there. Links to my affiliates down below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.